Because my own field is historical theology, we started where I knew the most, and I got together some colleagues, experts on very influential theologians like Luther, Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, and we had a very simple question. What did these theologians say, if anything, about children, about who they are, the status of children, the nature of children, and what we owe them? Not just the parents, but also the church and the wider community. So that was the very simple question. What did these theologians say, if anything, about who children are and what we owe them? And gosh, it was so interesting, all the materials that came out, because you look at like a Luther, right? Martin Luther, very influential theologian for many Protestant denominations, not just for Lutherans. And he had a lot to say about parenting. He wrote catechisms for use in the home, the small catechism, the large catechism, so parents could use that in their families to help teach the faith. It wasn't beneath him to write a catechism. We can't imagine it today, to have, one of our serious, really influential theologians writing materials for faith formation. It's unheard of. And some of the ways some of that material is written is really so haunting, how awful those materials sometimes are for children and young people in Sunday schools, right? You've seen it all, how awful that material is. So anyway, it was very fun to discover all kinds of thinking about children, families, parenting, obligations of the society and the church to children and young people. So that's the first book we did. Then I wanted to get together biblical scholars, very influential, important biblical scholars who had never maybe worked on children at all, but were recognized for their great work in biblical studies. So I got people like Brueggemann, maybe you know his name. He's a very influential biblical scholar in our context, to write a chapter for this book, also a collection of essays, or Pat Miller, who worked on Deuteronomy at Princeton. Now, these theologians hadn't written that much, these biblical scholars hadn't written that much about children, but we asked them, can you look back? You've studied Deuteronomy, you've studied Genesis, you've studied Proverbs. Can you look back and look a little more closely at what these texts say about children and about our obligations to children? And again, it was very eye-opening for many of these scholars who said, I didn't even see the theme of children, and yet, in Isaiah, it's just huge. And so the scholar in Isaiah was very impressed. Or Pat Miller, who wrote on Deuteronomy, said, I didn't realize how much it had to say about children and obligations to children. So that was exciting and very interesting and eye-opening for all scholars who had already done the work in these areas, but started asking new questions about children, about child-family relationships, about the community's obligations to children. So that was our second book. Then I wanted to also see, what did other world religions say about children? We've started to look at Christianity and some biblical texts. Is this a theme in other world religions? And this book, the third book we did, was on primary texts in 6 world religions on children. So it's just looking at varied texts. Some are liturgical, some are more essays, but a variety of texts from these 6 world religions on what they said about children. So I had 6 sub-editors. I'm not an expert in Confucianism or Buddhism, but we had a very good Hindu scholar from Emory. We had a Confucian scholar from Stanford, and they did the work then. And Don Browning and I from the University of Chicago edited the collection as a whole. So then the last book we just did, I wanted to get together mainly ethicists in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to see what did these 3 traditions, who are all monotheistic, have to say about commitments to children and values, obligations, general values and principles and mandates about children and obligations to them, and then what they said about certain very contemporary issues like child soldiers or children's rights or adoption, or child-parent relationships. So that's what we just finished this book on Jewish, Christian, Muslim views of children with Cambridge. So that's kind of my story. One thing you can learn from this, there's so much to do. I can think of like 10 books. We were talking yesterday. I said, whoa, you could do a great book on this. And then talking to Jan, you could do a great book on this, because there's so much work to do in this area.